And we're live. Hey, man.
Excellent. Hey, I feel like we should have some kind of newsy type music introducing us so we
A
get that
big
kind
a
of
big bumper at
and
the
over to
beginning.
the studio like hi, and we're live. Welcome to the News at 10. It's your host, Michael
You're
Veazey.
saying we do this like a clown show, basically. This is not professional.
No, I always have comic instinct. Sorry, it's just I was hanging around with my wife too much. She turns everything into comedy somehow. But yeah, no, this is
Well,
very serious concept, but dealt with a lightness of touch. I think
yes.
that's how
Well,
we're going to do this.
welcome for those of you who are starting to tune in here. We're broadcasting live to several locations, into several of our private groups, and then as well to our YouTube channel, actually to Michael's YouTube channel. And we're going to have a great conversation today. This is the recording of our live version of the podcast. And then we'll chop this up and use it in the podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and beyond in the near future. So, welcome if you're tuning in with us right now. We're going to jump into our podcast conversation here just momentarily. So, don't leave. It's a fantastic one. Michael, you've really put the background work into this topic. You want to mention a little bit of the detail about it
Yeah,
before
sure.
we
Sorry,
really do
my
the real thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is about the Flywheel Concept by Jim Collins. I've been pretty
Hmm.
obsessed with a lot of Jim Collins' work for a number of years. I'm not unique in that. I'm sure you have as well. And
Sure.
what I've been really trying to do recently is I've been trying to create a short program for e-commerce and specifically Amazon sellers that were doing, say, six figures to help them scale up to seven, and to really deep dive into like, what are the actual blocks to scaling.
Yeah.
And the more I've tried to dig into creating a model that would work for them, first of all, I've realized that a short program is a real challenge. You need to think on a bigger canvas. But the second thing I've realized is that the flywheel concept, and it was kind of like one of those head slapped moments when I realized after about 2 or 3 months work on this that actually the flywheel concept was kind of the conceptual framework for the answer for this. And
Hmm.
it's kind of obvious as soon as I articulated it, I thought, why don't I see that before?
Yeah.
So I've kind of come back round to the flywheel concept with a new respect for how powerful it is. And I've started applying it over the last 2, 3 months without really realizing
Yeah.
in certain aspects of businesses. And we're starting to see that flywheel spin in a very unsubtle way. And I've realized that it's therefore a framework that we really should address in our first principles because I think it's really, really powerful.
I love it. All right. Well, this is going to be a great session. If you're just tuning in live, I know people are popping in here. Welcome. And we're going to start our podcast recording in just a moment, talking all about how e commerce flywheels can scale your business. It's going to be a great one. Love it. Love it. Love it. All right. Let's just hang out for another moment and then we'll kick it off and go from there, huh?
Sounds good.
Good. If you're watching with us live, feel free to leave comments in any place that you're watching, on your Facebook groups that you're a part of that we're broadcasting into, or on the YouTube channel, and we will see them here in the back-end tool that we use, StreamYard, and happy to weave them into the broadcast and go from there. So yeah, shall we kick it off? We ready for this?
That sounds good. Yeah, I'm just double checking on our Facebook group, and
Okay,
we are indeed live, which is
awesome,
excellent. So we
great,
are broadcasting. It's all
good deal.
working. Good.
Let's go. Let's do this. Here we go. Here's the introduction, and we're jumping into it here. Jim Collins, in Good to Great, explained the concept of a business flywheel as a critical part of what makes businesses go from good to great. But what is the flywheel concept and how does it serve e commerce sellers? That's the question of the day. In this episode, we're going to dive into it. Michael, are you ready to start this project together?
I am ready and willing. Yes, let's
All
do
right,
this thing.
awesome. So tell us more about the e commerce aspect of the flywheel model that Jim Collins talked about in his book. For those who maybe haven't heard about this concept before or maybe aren't familiar with his work, why don't you just unpack it for us quickly?
Sure. So I start on the sort of general level and we'll work back down towards e-commerce specifics. But I mean, the first thing to say is that obviously Jim Collins famously worked in 2001, just after the book came out, just managed to time it perfectly to coincide with just after the 9/11 sort of collapse in the economy and everyone sort of being scared and not thinking courageously. But he was brought in by Jeff Bezos to the Amazon team, and Jeff Bezos credited this concept as being the sort of secret sauce for Amazon. So that's how powerful it is. So
Wow.
here's what Jim Collins says in his monograph of The Flywheel, which is one of his latest books, quite short, but specifically about this topic. He says, in creating a good to great transformation, so the original concept was in the book Good to Great, there's no single defining action, no single killer innovation. Rather, it feels like turning a giant heavy flywheel, Pushing with great effort, you get the flywheel to inch forward. You keep pushing and you get the flywheel to complete one entire turn. You keep pushing, the flywheel moves a bit faster, 2 turns, then 4, the flywheel builds momentum. Once you fully grasp how to create flywheel momentum in your particular circumstance and to apply that understanding with creativity and discipline, you get the power of strategic compounding. So in other words, he says you get a series of good decisions supremely well executed that compound on each other. And that is how you build greatness.
Wow, I love that. And for those of you who maybe don't even, like, you're watching, you're like, what's a flywheel again? So I mean, if you're not familiar with the actual physical metaphor, the flywheel in the front of an engine in a car is a weight that really helps the engine do something, build momentum and keep momentum. And the flywheel is a huge, important part of any big system, any big engine. And that idea of it capturing momentum and then retaining it and then increasing it, I think is a really interesting part of the visual metaphor for the flywheel itself. So I love that part of it. I do think that it's a fantastic metaphor. I don't think I remember that that Bezos brought in Jim Collins. So that's an interesting component of this story as well for all of us who are e-commerce sellers and Amazon-centric sellers in particular. You got to give props to Jim Collins if Jeff Bezos brought him in.
Yeah, absolutely.
The business.
Yeah, the thing about Jeff Bezos, lest we forget, everyone says he's the e-commerce guy, but he was in Wall Street for 10 years. So he's a man who understands conceptual things that pay off in money. Yeah. And so the fact he was very excited, fairly early adopter of this. He's since had people like Vanguard, the multi-billion-dollar guys with probably trillions under asset management now. It's been applied in lots and lots of big corporate companies. But what fascinates me is that you can bring it down to the e-commerce small business level, and I'm starting to see real results by applying this kind of thinking, which is when it gets really exciting to me.
So do you have the detail on how Jim Collins helped Amazon, some of the examples or details that we can start to walk through? I think there are probably a lot of niche examples, but what do you got for that?
Sure. So, I mean, the first thing to say is probably to define what the flywheel is. You talked about it as a metaphor, and that was really helpful. But specifically, Jim Collins says basically you need to have 4 to 6 components. And the idea is that each component inevitably leads to the next one. So what you're designing is a system which, once it's designed and once it's actually working the way it should, which is 2 big ifs, of course, but that it has an inevitability about the growth built into it, which is maybe what excited Jeff Bezos, because he's actually engineered that in Amazon famously and many other businesses as well. So the critical components need to be between about 4 and 6. If it's more than that, Jim Collins says it's too many. If it's fewer, maybe it's not quite enough. And the components flow into each other. So his sketch, which isn't the same as Jeff Bezos' probably wouldn't reveal this in public, of the Amazon flywheel is that you start with lower prices on more offerings, which is immediately, by the way, a problem. If you're selling on Amazon, please wake up to the reality of what we're doing with lower prices, more offerings. Second thing is you increase customer visits because you've got low price and good selection. Third thing is you attract third-party sellers. The fourth thing is you expand the store and extend the distribution as well. So more marketplaces across the globe, faster delivery in the US. The fifth component is you grow revenues per fixed costs. So you've got your fulfillment centers. They cost a hell of a lot of money, but they're going to grow the revenues relative to that. And then you can afford to offer lower prices on more offerings, and thus it goes back round again. And it's really obvious as an Amazon consumer or an observer of Amazon, even over the last sort of 6 years that I've been involved with it, that's really a very good description of how Amazon works.
Interesting. Yeah, I love
very
that.
interesting stuff. Yeah, it's very powerful stuff.
And I would imagine that they started to apply this thinking in a lot of their subcomponents of their business. Obviously, the one that comes to my mind is just the nature of their core product, which was originally selling books. And then, of course, they got that bolted down. They could sell books at scale. And then they inevitably went to the next step, which was, why don't we just buy a book publishing company? And then they bought CreateSpace. And then they're like, why don't we just, dominate the idea of digital publishing as well as paperback publishing? And they created KDP. And they were like, why don't we just sell our own devices for reading the Kindle books that we've created? And then that whole Kindle universe. I just bought a new Kindle Fire. I had one from 2015 that I wanted to get a upgrade a new to a new one, and I just think of that whole system, and I just think, wow, what a marvelous set of inevitabilities. They sold books, and then they just went to, hey, every bookmaker can publish with us, and here we go. We've got the Kindle device, and on and on. So I think they probably basically broken this thinking into the various aspects of their business in a really, really powerful way. Um, Other thoughts in terms of how this applies, or other examples that come to your mind?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, to your point, what's interesting about the flywheel concept is it's quite subtle because although it's in essence quite simple, and simple is powerful and scales, I think we overlook the power of simplicity
Hmm.
at our peril. But on the other hand, you need to grasp what it is. So the flywheel concept is not a set of products, it's not a set of practices, it's an
Hmm.
underlying thing, such as exactly as you said, really, if the underlying flywheel for Amazon is based around really lower prices, more offerings as the starting point, then that means once you've got the revenues from that, you can afford to go and swallow up other businesses, which gives you
Hmm.
more of the same. And so it can actually look very, very broad. For example, AWS does not seem, the Amazon Web Services doesn't it seem initially to fit in with Amazon, but it is really about they've got these fixed costs anyway with their
Hmm.
web servers, so
Hmm.
they might as well make more revenue per fixed cost, and then that leads down to lower prices and more offerings. Even if the revenue comes from the web services and the lower prices show up in the Amazon.com retail store.
Yeah.
So the whole flywheel concept is more subtle than it appears once you really look into it, because it
Hmm.
underlines very different looking from the outside products and services. But if it aligns with the inner flywheel,
Hmm.
then it still makes sense and will help the business to scale. Uh,
Well,
uh,
yeah. I guess the way I would look at it is at sort of the meta level, because Jim Collins' reflection on the Amazon implementation of the flywheel is, you can tell he's an academic and not really an Amazon seller, because first of all, the first concept is they have lower prices, which isn't true. Um, but but if you think about it, I would describe their meta flywheel as they pioneered technology for online selling. Then they invited other people to work on their platform with them for online selling. And those are the flywheel components that I think really, really unlocked, the Amazon third party seller system is, of course, what I'm talking about. That is what unlocked their scale. Now, they did the exact same thing with AWS. They built a massive server farm to work in the cloud, which, then nobody even knew what that phrase was, but it was server space. And they then invited other businesses to lean into their technology, in essence, to use the business tools that they had created, and they sold it to them. And of course that became even more profitable for them than third party marketplace selling, or even the core product selling.
hmm.
I think that's
Interesting.
sort of the meta version of their flywheel, I would
I
think.
like it. Well, I like the fact that you are on air disagreeing with Jim Collins's own interpretation of the Amazon flywheel.
I'm
But you may
happy
well be
to.
right, because he did say, look, this is my interpretation. I mean, what's interesting really, and
Yeah.
what's relevant is to grasp it for yourself, and you're
Hmm.
going to have to work this through with your team or whatever. And
Hmm.
what they did with Amazon.com, as they have done with Vanguard and multiple other big businesses, is get them into their kind of lab, and they have a lot of discussions. And really the
Hmm.
question of what are the right components, and they'll go through, and there's a whole list of questions that I've got sort of printed out and put on my wall here, because I think it's so basic to what I'm doing at the moment. But
Yeah. Yeah.
it's really, looking at your successes and failures and what's the underlying architecture that
Hmm.
drove those, and then identifying the right components, and then, doing a lot of hard work to really deep dive into interrogating this. Is this
Hmm.
actually something that drives this? Is there an inevitability about those things? So there
Yeah.
is a lot of discussion, and there's no fixed correct answer, which is always the difficult thing with strategic work. It's not that satisfying thing of do this and then you get this result that you get on the tactical
Hmm.
marketing level.
Yeah.
But I think it's an important argument to have, if you like. And by the way, just there is a simpler way to approach this, which is if you're an earlier stage, smaller business, you can just simply identify or analyze somebody else's flywheel and then basically copy it, which can be very successful. There's one other example in the Flywheel monograph by Jim Collins about there was a chap who was a very expert on cycling, and he wanted to create a really sort of sexy looking, very stylish, comfortable and aerodynamic bike helmet for really high end cyclists.
Hmm.
And so he was trying to think of how to get out of the garage to actually get this into a scalable business. And he studied
Hmm.
Nike, and he said, okay, his insight was simply there's a hierarchy of social influence for athletic stuff. If you get
Hmm.
a Tour de France winner to wear your helmet, serious non-professional cyclists wear it, then the weekend warriors buy it, and then people like me who aren't so serious cyclists but like to, not look like a complete idiot on the bike, will buy it. And then so basically, what happened is he persuaded Greg LeMond to wear the Giro helmet, and in the 1989 Tour de France, he rode in. I think it was with one of the first non-Europeans ever to win it, and probably still one of those. And of course, then that kicked off a whole flywheel. So he invented a great product. That's nothing
Hmm.
to be overlooked. Got an elite athlete to use them. Those are not easy steps.
Yeah. Right.
He inspired weekend warriors. You attract mainstream customers. You build a brand, and then because of the brand, you can set high prices, and then you could channel the profits that come from higher
Hmm.
prices into R&D and create new great products.
Hmm.
Which weirdly enough is not that different from the underlying flywheel of Intel, which is in memory chips, which seems to have absolutely nothing to do with it. But the interesting thing about the flywheel is it's because it's a conceptualized framework that's kind of so abstract that actually product lines per se may not look at all like each other, but the underlying architecture could be the same, which I find
Hmm.
very fascinating.
Yeah.
But that is definitely a very e-commerce example, I would say.
Just as a total side note, do you think that the Walmart executives about 10 years ago read Jim Collins' Good to Great book, and were thinking to themselves, "Man, that Amazon flywheel model looks pretty darn appealing. we got our own flywheel that's working pretty good with brick and mortar store, but what if we bolted on the Amazon flywheel to our brick and mortar operation, and we actually did deliver low prices
Yeah.
and invite, because what is interesting about the Walmart flywheel, if you've ever gone into a Walmart and just looked at a specific section of their store, like they only have 4 or 5 things products in each category, so they go very, very, very shallow at the individual product level. But they have in their store, of course, then they've got massive numbers of varieties of products as the ultimate most complete provider in a way. But at the individual niche level, they're very thinly sourced in terms of products, which is complete opposite of Amazon online, where Amazon, you go to look for blenders and you've got like 50,000 different choices. But so this is where it really gets interesting to me, is where Walmart starts to interlace uh, its opportunity for its brick and mortar model into the e-commerce space and unlock third-party sellers. It's as if they're going to have their killer model, literally killer, like they kill stores all over the world. And then they're layering on this provide every possible product in the world through e-commerce in addition to their in-store model. It's going to be very fascinating to see how that plays out in real life. Um, anyway,
That's
so
very
yeah.
interesting. So, in other words, maybe you're thinking that what Jim Collins thought was articulating the Amazon business model, in his own words, is actually a better articulation of the Walmart.com model as it expands it into e-commerce. Is that about what you're saying?
Well, I think what I'm saying is what Collins is articulating there is not actually an Amazon flywheel. It is an e-commerce marketplace flywheel.
Hmm.
And Walmart could literally just be like, boop, plug that in. Oh, now we've got the lowest prices on more offerings. Now we increase our customer visits. Now we
Hmm.
attract third-party sellers. We're going to have our own third-party seller system, just like Walmart. How is this unique to Amazon? As I look at this model, it is not. It is
It,
just an e-commerce flywheel.
it's very funny you should say that about the word unique, because in the very next thing after this Giro helmet example in the flywheel, the very, very next thing is the words a flywheel need not be unique.
Yeah,
So there's an interesting point you put,
yeah,
because basically he says something like this. Let me just bring this up. So uh, two successful organizations can have similar flywheels. What
yes.
matters most is how well you can understand your flywheel and how well you can execute on each component over a long series of iterations.
So do
So
you think that Amazon basically is in a flywheel battle with Walmart? Because when
maybe.
Walmart started to move into e-commerce, Amazon bought Whole Foods, moving into brick and mortar. And then I don't know if you saw an article, but they've rolled out in the last year like 800 Amazon It's not called Amazon Go. There's a couple different store models that they're using. But anyway, in brick and mortar, in-person Amazon stores, they've rolled out 800 in the last year, and they're not really making a big fanfare out of it. But they're trying to develop that local in-person store experience. So it's maybe flywheel battle of the Godzilla versus King Kong going on here.
It could be. It's very, very interesting. I mean, yeah, there's nothing unique about a flywheel. So I think for an early stage business or a small business, small as in relatively, a few $1 million a year
Yeah,
revenue,
yeah,
there's nothing unique about a flywheel. But the thing is, most people just not only do they not read Jim Collins and then implement it, but they're not even willing to actually take strategy seriously, and they're just
right.
copying the tactical stuff. So I
Yeah.
think it's an open secret that if you want to copy an existing flywheel and it works really, really well, most people around you won't do that, and therefore you're going to have a competitive advantage
Hmm.
until maybe 10 years later when they wake up, in which
Yeah.
case you're established. So
Yeah.
that's the broad idea anyway. So I know you've got a very specific way of applying
Hmm.
flywheel thinking as it relates to small and medium sized e-commerce businesses. So tell me about that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, in our work with clients for the last 3.5 years, we've basically sort of clarified our own version of I guess you could say, a flywheel concept. And then I wrote about it in E-commerce Power, my new book. It's basically this outline, and we do a deep dive into it. And I would say that the adaptation of this idea for our use is really in support of one specific e-commerce business model, which I describe as the niche, uh, you know, brand e-commerce model, which is basically dependent on the concept of you finding an ideal target audience and building a brand to serve them. And so that's very different than retail arbitrage, or wholesaling widely, or online arbitrage, or anything else. It's not. It doesn't make sense for merch, or any of the other potential business models in the e-commerce space. It really is built for people who have a branded product line that they're putting in front of a specific set of customers. So anyway, with all that said, that's sort of the adaptation of the model we've done, and it has 8 steps. Our model has 8 components to it that we work with clients on, and we work with them on these steps every day. It's always the centerpiece of our conversations.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to obviously ask you what those steps are in a sec, but I
Sure.
think I just wanted to pick up on the fact that what you just pointed out, I couldn't agree more, that just because something from the outside looks very similar, the underlying flywheel, or if you want to use another metaphor, that the strategic sort of components that lead to success and to
Hmm.
growth,
Yeah.
the drivers of the business, another word you might want to use,
Yeah.
can be completely different. And I really think that's important to grasp at a very deep level. Like the fact that everything's on Amazon, or it happens to be online, or even you call something a Shopify store,
Hmm.
for that matter, the mechanics of it, the platform, should not distract you from the underlying drivers. And I think you're 100% right.
Yeah.
To the difference in business model, in other words, is more profound than it looks at all from the outside.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
having said that, yes, what are these 8 components for a flywheel for an e-commerce brand-driven business?
Yeah. Happy to mention them. The first one is goals, and it's so funny. You think you could settle your goals question in your mind and then build your business, and you wouldn't have to revisit your goals. But it's not true. You always have to revisit goals. And the biggest bifurcation of in the goals space is the real fundamental question of whether you want to have a laptop lifestyle as seen on TV from the beach, where although laptops won't work well from a beach, I'm sure. I've never tried it, but you know what I mean. It's the vagabonding lifestyle where you don't have any real business office or anything. Or do you want to build a legitimate company where you've got an office you go into and staff and all that? That's one of the most fundamental questions. So that's a goal question. And then so I'll just go through them quickly here. The second leg of our flywheel is creating a brand, and having it be uniquely yours, and have a powerful attributes. The third component is having a product or product suite. We like to call it an integrated product suite that transcends physical. It could also be informational products. The fourth component is strategic pricing, and the fifth component is presentations, and by that we mean photography, videography, graphic art, all of the and copywriting, all of the online presentation components. The sixth component in our flywheel is placement, and that's, you could call that the omnichannel strategy, or the channel strategy. How many places do you sell? Obviously, Shopify is the one that I work with clients on every day, help them build their sites or build their sites for them, sometimes even. And then Kyle, my business partner, is the Amazon expert. But we're going more and more into deep and meaningful conversations and real hard work with clients on Etsy and on Walmart, and other platforms are emerging. eBay, of course, has always been there. So the whole idea of the omni-channel piece is what we call placement. The seventh one is promotion, which is all things traffic, which is a massive topic in and of itself. We've talked a lot in prior podcasts about my 9 mountains framework. And then the final component of our flywheel is growth. And by that, we mean team growth, facilities growth, financing, all of the business aspects, that will be more and more meaningful as you gain velocity of sales. You have to answer the hard questions like, where do I put all this stuff, and where do I put all these people, and how do I organize all of this legally, and on and on. So those are the 8 components of our flywheel.
Very interesting stuff. I mean, one thing that makes me think about is, first of all, the priorities that people have show up in a flywheel. And it's interesting how we've both got a version of a flywheel, and I'll share my version in a second. And to start with, when we were discussing this, I was thinking, oh no, it's a conflict. It looks really bad that we don't have the same flywheel. And I thought, duh, of course, unconsciously, I'm creating a flywheel that works for Amazon-based sellers. And obviously, you guys are focused on people who, while they may sell on Amazon or indeed Etsy or wherever else, they're trying to create more of a direct-to-consumer brand. And of course, a lot of my guys are working in that direction, but my starting point is different. So, and the interesting thing is, whilst the flywheel need not be entirely unique, as per Jim Collins' statement, equally, I guess it doesn't matter if it's different than somebody else's as long as it works. And I think that one of the most important things is simply to diagnose whether it's a logical construct and whether you can justify it by going back to basically empirical examples from your own business. I think in the end, it is a personal thing.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to flag up as well is something that Jim Collins brought up, which is really important, which is this, that a flywheel is only as good as the weakest part, because each thing inevitably leads to the next thing, inevitably leads to the next thing.
Yeah.
However, if one of the components is broken and does not lead to the next thing, none of the other things happen.
That's so true.
If you're really like 8 out of 10 for goal setting, 8 out of 10 for branding, 8 out of 10 for product, 8 out of 10 for pricing, 8 out of 10 presentation, and then your placement, you're all over the map with your channels, and it's broken at that point, then your flywheel will not fly, and you will not scale, and you will not get to a great business.
Wow, that is so interesting, and I never thought of that before. But I'll just describe, if I can, some of our introductory conversations we have with coaching clients. They'll inquire and they'll want our help, and we're happy to set up a 30-minute introductory call. And in that call, we've already seen their website. We've already heard all about their business because they fill out an application. And one of the things they don't know that we know is that we have this flywheel model that we are then the lens through which we're looking at their business is this flywheel model. And we can immediately see problems frequently, or have questions about their business. Now, what's interesting is we get on that call, and sometimes we see, oh, they've got a real problem here with their, let's just say branding, because that's such an easy one to pick on. They got a real problem with their branding. But we get on the call and they ask us all about traffic, and their whole passion is about traffic. That's all they want to talk about is traffic. And then we're all like, okay, now we're in coaching mode almost immediately, because we immediately just share this flywheel. We say, well, these are the things that we work on. And then we just wait to see if it piques their interest. And it's really about having, to your point, to Jim Collins' point, an understanding of where you're at on the spectrum. Are you a 3 or are you a 10 on that 0 to 10 scale for each of these flywheel components? And sometimes people are operating businesses, they don't even understand the components of their business. And so that's why a coach is valuable. A coach is the person, as I think, is a Tom Landry quote that's just so famous. A coach is a person who tells you what you don't want to hear and makes you do things you don't want to do so that you can become the person you always wanted to be. It's roughly kind of a remembered quote version of Tom. And Tom Landry was a famous football coach for the Dallas Cowboys.
Wow, I like that.
Yeah.
That's classic hardcore. What you call football, or what I call
Yeah.
American football. I mean, it looks to me like a really hardcore game. I knew you were a
Yeah.
player yourself at one point, anyway, and
Yeah.
somehow unsurprising that such a tough sport should produce such a tough quote. But I really kind of like that. I mean, part of me is also,
Yeah.
make people suffer. But the thing is, you picked up the two or three things I want to pick up and what you said, really critical points. First of all, let's start with what you just said. People don't even know the components of their own business. That's really true. And it's so hard. You cannot see the wood for the trees. You kind of
Mhm.
need an outside eye, I think,
Yeah.
whether it's a peer or a coach or whatever. I would say
Yeah.
both. In the end, the more I do this stuff, the more I think you've got to have a coach and a mastermind. I think that's the minimum, really,
Mhm.
if you're
Mhm.
intelligent. The
Yeah.
second thing is, if you don't know your components, there's no way you can know your flywheel. So actually, the number of
Mhm.
people who really have articulated their flywheel, even though the book's been out for 20 years exactly now, is tiny. I never hear business owners in the e-commerce space talking about this. So
Yeah.
it's a kind of hidden competitive advantage that you cannot just reverse engineer by using Jungle Scout or some
Mhm.
other tool like that, really.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
the other thing I wanted to say that you picked up on, which is incredibly important, is if you think you know what the problem is, but you're misdiagnosing it, that's even worse because you'll
Mhm.
spend months fixing a problem, which you go from a 7 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10 in a business.
Yeah.
But if you've got a 3 out of 10 component, then that's the thing you need to work on. And you just really
Yeah.
put your finger on that.
The real quote, I just looked it up, is a coach is someone who tells you what you don't want to hear, who has you see what you don't want to see, so you can become who you've always known you could be. That's so good, isn't it? That's just
It's very good.
fantastic. Yeah.
It is. It doesn't
Wonderful.
sound very inviting as a sales pitch for coaching. We're going to struggle to get anybody to come and work with us on that basis. But yeah, I think it's true. There is a certain component where you've got to bring people in, and this is about a coaching conversation, but it's all related to being
Yeah.
willing to stand back and look at your business as a machine, as a component, and as a
Yeah.
thing from a 80,000 foot perspective, if you like, for the
Yeah.
flywheel.
Sure.
And a lot of people aren't willing to do that, and I guess you just can't really help somebody that way. But all I would say is that there's so much power in this,
Mhm. Yeah.
um,
Love
so
it.
it's worth it.
Well, walk us through your adaptation of the flywheel for Amazon-centric sellers. How
Sure.
do you interpret this? Yeah.
Amazon centric, yeah. Still haven't got rid of the drug from their system. The first thing is, I guess I hadn't really articulated clearly enough, but when I think about why I created it, it was in response to really what's the perceived problem. And I asked a bunch of Amazon sellers sort of a few months ago, and doing more than $50,000 a month, the kind of, mid
Mhm.
six figures, what's the biggest problems in your business that stop you scaling? And I suppose for me, the implicit desired goal is growth. So I suppose you've put that as one of the components of your flywheel. I suppose this is all about growth in a cash flow driven world like Amazon. So there are really 6 components. The first one is great product development, which is not very different to anybody in e-commerce, I guess. Second one is optimizing listings for conversion, which is kind of mechanical, but people overlook it. And I had a
Mhm.
6-figure seller, the 7-figure seller. It's probably about $10 million a year at the moment, run rate. And she was asking about PPC. So how do I send traffic? And I
Yeah.
looked at the listings. I said, before you send the traffic, there are so many obvious wins here that I could help
Right.
you with the listing. So I'm actually going to go and do some optimization for her. So people overlook that at their peril. It's very simple, but
Mhm.
people don't do it. The third thing is profitable traffic. So on Amazon, you've got to optimize for SEO and then blend in profitable PPC. And obviously
Mhm.
off Amazon, as you said, 9 mountains, there's a huge area. The fourth one is cash flow management, which is not as sexy as branding, and people sometimes overlook it, mostly overlook it. And things like reducing your cash conversion cycle, getting the right deals with suppliers can
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely unlock growth. The next one, however, is stock management, because if you're terrible at stock management, you're either overstocked or
Mhm.
you're out of stock,
Yeah.
which happened in 2020 so often. Then that puts a real bump in this sort of cash flow, and that mini cash flow flywheel. So cash into stock, stock into cash, is absolutely a critical kind of mini flywheel in and of itself. And if I had to strip it
Sure.
down to one thing, that's the thing I'd be obsessed with, because
Mhm.
I perceive it as the single biggest problem for Amazon sellers anyway.
Yeah, just as a quick interjection there, that's so amazingly important because you hear so many times people who get that little loop going,
Hmm.
but they haven't figured out how to extract net profit for their own livelihoods.
Yeah, you're
It's like,
absolutely right. It's quite possible because I articulated some stuff for my own sort of, applying this recently to stuff. And I looked at the podcasts that I got going, Amazing FBN, 10K Collective in their little circles behind me. And I looked at the podcast Flywheel and I thought, this is spinning kind of nicely. I've got good
Mhm.
quality guests. I'm attracting people, therefore I'm attracting more quality guests. And I thought the only thing it isn't doing is spinning off enough cash for me. So you're absolutely right that it is quite you're very, very important some point.
Yeah.
You've got to get a flywheel that spits out cash, because
Yes.
otherwise you're growing it for the sake of it. And that
Mhm.
does happen on Amazon a lot, that you get
Mhm.
people after 3-4 years and they've got to $1 million run rate and they're going, when do I get paid? Oh, hang on, never, because I've engineered it that way. I've made sure my staff get paid and my suppliers get paid. And
Bezos gets paid.
Bezos is always, he doesn't need to be getting paid. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. And then
Yeah.
only really when you've got the cash flow and stock management piece really sorted, cash flow meaning, yeah, it throws off free cash flow, aka
Mhm.
profit,
Mhm.
for sure. Then the semi-optional, but I say semi-optional, you could skip this bit, but in reality, most people seem to use it, which is funding of some kind. So in order of difficulty and complication, that would be new equity investment by the owner, i.e. you as the business owner and manager, factoring receivables. Factoring is a bit of a dirty word, but it's less risky than debt because it depends
Yeah.
on, they take the cash flow as it comes in,
Yeah.
debt, and then equity investment by outside investors, which seems like a great solution and is actually really complicated on the back end. And then you're back to product development again because you've got more money to fund that. You can employ better designers, you can spend more money on the prototypes, etc.
Yeah.
And then you go back round.
I love your model. We're looking at a visual presentation of it, just so you know, as we do this conversation, and I think Michael, that would be great to share some at some point visually, and we can put my flywheel up too as a resource. This is fantastic, and the evolution of, or the rotation of your model around to product centric thinking is so vital in my mind, because here's a very frequent scenario: new e-commerce seller launches a product. It does okay, but not great. They make sales, but they don't make any money. But in the course of launching that product, they discover an audience and they learn how to serve that audience even better. And their second evolution around, or rotation around your flywheel, where they go back to new product development, they are so much more, we call it deadly if you want to, in terms of their execution skills. They just have laser beam focused in on better opportunities than they started with, because they know so much more about the ideal customer, what they want, what they need, what alternatives exist, on and on. And that that rotation around the your model there, I think what we see over and over again is that e-commerce sellers who are successful learn with every go round that model. Every rotation around your cycle, they come back with, like, boom, more dialed in product, boom, better cash flow product, boom, better frequency of sales, velocity of sales product, on and on and on. And of course, if you do all of that with a niche centric specific customer in mind, where you're serving one community of sellers with every go round of your new product, ideally you get better and better at it. And that's how you build, of course, a massive growing operation, is by attracting, because ideally you've got the customer.
Yeah.
And if you do it off of Amazon, you do it on your own Shopify site, and you start with, let's just say, your first evolution of the product, of your first product, you've got 1,000 customers.
Yeah.
And then once your second product comes out, you've got 1,000 customers you can send it to that product, and you don't have to pay for those customers.
Yeah.
Your
That's
cost
really
for the
powerful.
acquisition for those customers is zero.
Yeah. This is when the Shopify, or your own direct-to-consumer site, in the end, building your own audience wherever you sell them, but having access to people just for product development is critical. You're right, and in the way my flywheels kind of, it's like all flywheels, it's a great simplification. One of the issues you have in the Amazon world is it's great cash flow conversion mechanism, which is really powerful, but the customer customer interaction, and therefore the product development with the customer, is really difficult. But the ones that I know do it anyway, and often because in truth they don't have a pure Amazon-based business. They have Amazon and their own Shopify store. They have off Amazon marketing pieces, etc. So the main thing I would say about what you said, though, just this really reiterating what Jim Collins says, let us not miss this, folks, if you're listening. It feels like pushing a giant heavy flywheel. This is not a quick win.
Right.
Then you get one with great effort, you get the flywheel to inch forward. With persistent effort, you get it to complete one turn. You keep pushing, it goes over 2, 4, 8. It takes time to get momentum. And it's so important to say this. I'm being the Tom Handy or Landy or whatever his name is now. I'm like,
Tom Landry. Yeah.
It's gonna take some effort, dude. So don't expect this to be a quick win. That's all I'm saying.
I'm a visual thinker. So do you remember the very opening scene of Conan the Barbarian, the
I
Arnold
do not.
Schwarzenegger movie?
Fortunately, I don't. So I think it might scar me. No, I don't. I don't recall it.
Well, okay, so the first sequence in Conan the Barbarian is his village gets raided and all his people get killed except he gets taken in to be a slave, and they put him on a big giant like grinding mill for maize or whatever. It's like this ginormous machine, and he has to push, like, push it. And he's like 9 years old. And then it fast forwards and he's like 20 years old and he's Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's like this huge, massive Hulk of a guy. And it was because he was pushing on this grinding mill, kind of the similar idea of this first rotation is impossible. But after you do it for a few years, you develop the muscle. And I think that's a good visual metaphor. Yeah.
I like it. Now, talking about visual metaphors, moving on swiftly from Arnie,
Yeah.
who I'm kind of a big fan of, by the way. I'm a big fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's a much deeper character than you'd think initially.
He is. Yeah.
But Conan the Barbarian is one kind of reference point. But let's reference, ancient fossils and the Nautilus, as I understand it. So tell us about this visual metaphor you got.
Well, yeah. The visual metaphor of the flywheel is fine, but when I think about it, the problem with the visual metaphor of the flywheel is Jim Collins doesn't really have a model that factors in a dynamic growth. Like you could visually think about a flywheel being small, and as the big business gets bigger, the flywheel gets bigger and bigger. But that's not really an effective visual. I think a Fibonacci sequence is smarter, where a Fibonacci sequence, if you've ever seen that metaphor, it's like how the seashell grows, and there's a whole bunch of plants. It's in nature everywhere. It's kind of amazing when you look into that whole thing. But the idea is that it starts small, and these numbers like 1 and 1 equals 2, 1 and 2 equals 3, 2 and 3 equals 5, and it develops this spiral that grows exponentially larger and larger and larger. That sequence of like a seashell growth visual, I think, like a flywheel starts with your business very, very small. As you get bigger, of course, it scales with you. And I think that's sort of the visual metaphor that I think is more interesting. It's more like a Fibonacci flywheel. Ooh, maybe we should call it that. The Fibonacci flywheel for e-commerce.
Yeah, you could. I would call it. Yeah, it sounds quite sexy actually. I would call it a nautilus because that's the ancient sort of shells that grew, millions, hundreds of millions of years ago. But yeah, it's the Fibonacci flywheel does sound pretty cool.
There you go.
There you go. Well, you get the copyright on that one, I think. Very cool. I love what you're saying because what it implies is it kind of takes account of the dynamic nature, as it say. It's a bit more like, as you say, pushing a flywheel that gets gradually bigger, but it changes shape as well as you go. There's lots of deep things, but yeah, exponential growth broadly, or compound growth is the other word that Jim Collins used as I spoke his words at the beginning of the show. And I think it's easy to underestimate that. I think that compound everything is really good or really bad. As long as it's in your favor, it's really, really good.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, it's really powerful.
I love this. Concept. Let's bring this conversation home to roost here for those who are listening. And how do we have this apply specifically? Any thoughts or ideas for personal implementation?
Yeah, so I guess one of the first things to do really is you got two choices. You can either steal or analyze somebody else's flywheel and or capture your own. And I would suggest both either or, but both and, which is one of Jim Collins' other great concepts. So he's got a list. I'm just going to quickly go through. It's in the Flywheel. I think it's just called Flywheel, a monograph by Jim Collins. So definitely worth buying because it's a really short, very powerful book, incredible book. The steps are, first of all, you create a list of significant replicatable successes or replicable successes. Analyze new initiatives and offerings, new products that have really gone better than you thought they would. And then a list of failures and disappointments, which is less fun. And I know Americans don't like dwelling on failure. Brits will be more comfortable with that piece. But either which way, stuff that really underperformed. And then compare the two and ask, how do these successes and disappointments tell us about the possible components of the flywheel? And then using the components, sketch the flywheel out. Where does it start? What follows next? And you've got to be able to explain why each component follows the previous one. Step 5, if you've got more than 6 components, you're making it complicated, try and consolidate and simplify.
Oops.
Step 6, test the flywheel against your list of successes and disappointments. Does your empirical experience validate it? Tweak it until you can explain your big successes as arriving from a flywheel and your disappointments as failures to execute or failures to stick to or adhere to a flywheel. And then the 7th one is a whole different concept. Test the flywheel against the 3 circles of your hedgehog concept, which is what you're deeply passionate about, what you can be the best in the world at, and what drives your economic or resource engine.
Oh man, that's good.
So it's a good list. And that's the more complicated version. The simpler version is go to Jason and Kyle or me once I've developed this into a program and use an existing insight, an existing framework. I think either can work. It just depends on how much you like reinventing the wheel, really.
Yeah. Well, I love this. This has been a fantastic conversation. E-commerce flywheel concepts, I think, are a wonderful thing for all of us as online sellers to think through and really adapt to our own business specifically and ask the question, how does this relate? How do I strengthen the components of my business and take things from maybe it's a 1 or 2 or 3 on a scale to 8, 9, 10 for every part of the business. And so I think that's fantastic thinking. So Michael, thank you as always for wonderful conversation. I would just encourage you to go check out Michael's work. What's the best location? Is it amazingfba.com or what's the best website?
To be absolutely honest, this stuff, I'm really working on re-engineering everything about the business. So, I mean, once that's clearer, then I'm going to have the website sort of things to reflect it. So I will keep you posted. I mean, just basically to say that I've got a 3-year program in development, or 18 months to 3 years, depending on how long it takes to get to that point, to help basically 10x your business with growing out of the work of the 10K Collective, empirical evidence, if you like, base, which I'm now trying to kind of put into conceptual frameworks that I think are valid and strong. So it's going to take a while to develop, and I want to let it out there.
Okay, but just in terms of how to learn more about Michael Veazey.
How to learn more about me, yeah. I mean, just go to the amazonmastermind.com and you can find out about the 10K Collective Mastermind, which is very much alive and kicking and in progress. And I would also point out that the e-commerce power book, as you referenced, that it sort of references the components you just talked about, and that is very much a big picture book, right? Unlike the 9 months of traffic, which is moderately big picture, the traffic piece, and then all the very specific platform-centric things you've done, say Instagram power, etc. That's going to be a great thing to read, to understand more of your thinking about this stuff. And then, of course, if people want to get in touch for coaching, you've already referenced that a couple of times. Sort of, it's based around this flywheel concept. How do people get in touch about that?
Yeah, winningonshopify.com is our website, and then there's a coaching tab. Happy to have people visit for that, for sure.
Great.
Yeah, love it. All right, my man. Well, wonderful conversation as always. Thank you so much. And for those of you who are watching live with us, thank you for your participation. And it's always an honor to be able to serve y'all with content like this. So check us out next Sunday morning for another live presentation, and we'll go from there. So see you, buddy.
Take care.